Hey, social work students, welcome to week 7 of Social Work 321. A lot of great information this week. Hope you're enjoying the class. Remember, this is the week that your assignment to do your genogram is due. And please don't hesitate to call, text, or email me if you have any questions about that assignment. It's a really important assignment. Help you kind of recognize your own personal background. And again, we want to do the work on ourselves so that our sessions aren't about ourselves, but about our clients. So once we've done that dirt work, looked up our family history, recognized who the alcoholics are, what is in our genetic makeup. And I'm telling you, when I did mine, I learned so much about myself because there were a whole lot of capital red A's in my background. There were a lot of alcoholics, autism, and Alzheimer's. Those were the 3 big A's that there were a lot of. There are also a lot of big C's. Cancer runs in my family. But I think that addiction thing is a very important thing to understand because there is a genetic component to being genetically predisposed to addiction issues. And I remember I once went on a cruise with a friend, and she's like, "Come on, have a glass of wine. It's gonna be great. Nobody'll know. You can just relax." And I'm like, "Honey, my mother was an alcoholic. I can't even go there." So there's some important things that you can learn from your genogram. And I'm excited for you to have that experience. One of my early experiences as a social worker was in East Cleveland, in which I worked with women that were some men too, but they were parents of children in the Head Start program. And the goal was to help them get off of welfare. So this was during one of the Bush era reforms where the motive was to try to get people off of welfare. And so anyway, I worked with an agency that entitled the program Invictus Training. And one of the things that we did with these parents of children from the Head Start program was we would help them do a genogram. And it was really interesting as these people worked on their own genograms to see some of the revelation come to their minds as they saw what had gone on in their family history, and they recognized where some of the connections with relationships and with addiction issues came from. So great work. I think this will be a great assignment for you. We're going to review chapter 7 today. There's so much great information in there about preparing for a session with a client. And we're probably going to talk mostly about one-on-one sessions today. I might bring in a few ideas for group work. I think it's important to remember that group work started in the 30s. This was when social workers first got excited about doing group work. And if you don't know why, it's interesting to note that it was because of the AA program, where Bill Wilson had so much success with his ideas that were very revolutionary, that he used with the AA program, that social workers wanted to get on board. And so we started studying group work, and it continues to be today an important part of what we do as social workers. And so I'll probably touch a little bit on that today, but I think we'll mostly focus on preparing for a one-on-one session with a client. So one of the things that's really important to note is that the early dropout rate for clients receiving outpatient therapeutic services is high. Early dropout rate. So how do we retain clients? How do we help clients want to, have a desire to continue with services? And there's several motivations for this. One would be financial motivation. You're going to do better, especially if you're doing contract work as a social worker, you're going to do better if your client shows up to every session, right? You don't have to. One of the things that I would do, especially working with Medicaid clients, is give a 3 strikes and you're out rule. And that is at the very first session, let them know I am, I'm happy to provide services for you. You need to know that I'm an in-demand social worker. And so if you don't show up, I will give you 3 chances. The 3rd time you don't show up, you will not be allowed to come back. And so that needs to be established at the very beginning. And you need to be firm about that. You can't say it and not do it. You have to be consistent. So what are some of the reasons that we have this high dropout rate? It has to do with differences between the personal and cultural expectations of clients and social workers. So making sure that you clarify what you expect from the client and what they expect from you. Make sure that you're on the same page that way. If you get a client that comes in and has some incredibly unrealistic expectations, and you will get this. I had people come in and sit down and say, I need you to fix my kid. Okay, yeah. We don't fix, do we? We give you a safe place to figure out your own solutions, and I will, I'll work with your child, I'll talk with your child, but they're going to have to fix themselves, and there probably needs to be some repair work done within the entire family. If a child is struggling, typically that means the parents are struggling, right? So it's very rare that I've worked with a child that it wasn't more a problem with the parents than with the actual kid. Do you have to make yourself known? Yeah, okay, that's fine. So another reason that we have this high dropout rate is failure by the social worker to express understanding of the client's view of the problems. If you don't agree with what their perspective is, and I'm not saying that you have to agree, but you do have to empathize, right? You do have to see it from the client's point of view as best you can. Failure of the social worker to be sufficiently and effectively prepared for these first meetings. So it's imperative that you are prepared. And it's interesting. There's an old saying, a penny is worth a pound. If you do a little bit of work early on, it's going to pay off in the end. So making sure that you go over any case notes that you have from the referring clinician. Starting off with an attitude, one of the things that we talked about last week is, knowing your client's name and using their name every time. And I would even often write notes in their file about significant things to ask the client about. One of the big problems, an early dropout rate, maybe you'll have the client come back for the second session, and in the first session you gave them homework, and in the second session you never ask about it, and maybe they put a lot of effort into whatever homework. And a lot of times I would give a client homework of going on a walk every day, getting out in the sunlight and getting some endorphins from physical exercise and from the sun. And if I didn't ask about that, then there goes my competency as a social worker and as a professional. So effective preparation is really important. Careful planning done before the first and the rest of the meetings with the client can make a difference in the dropout rate. So make sure that before you meet with the client, make sure you're engaged in the following. I'm going to give you a list, and this is in your PowerPoint that you have this week. So go over this, make sure you're familiar with these concepts. So before you meet with the client, you're going to review, you're going to explore, you're going to consult, arrange, you're going to prepare your own empathy for this client's situations, and you'll probably do some preparatory self-exploration. Centering is an important concept, and then preliminary planning and recording. Okay, let's start out talking about preparatory reviewing. So preparatory reviewing involves examining and considering information available to you and your agency before an initial contact with your client. So intake forms for returning clients, records of previous periods of service are very, very important. The benefits of doing this is that your client won't have to repeat information that they've already given. So if you've got someone, if this client has been referred from elsewhere and you already have a complete file on them, if you read through that and are familiar with it, then the client doesn't have to repeat yourself. You're not wasting a lot of time. A couple of professional situations I'd like to share with you. So this was a story that I heard in a training here in Las Vegas. This social worker had a woman who came in, and I'm sorry, it was a man who was the social worker, and he was telling the story about another social worker who was a woman. And this woman had a male client who came in, and she had not read the file on him, and he had a serious foot fetish. And if you don't know anything about fetishes, look it up. But basically, if he saw a naked female foot, he got very turned on. And so she wore sandals to the session. She had not read the file, and I mean, it's Vegas. You wear sandals about 6 months out of the year down here at least. Most women do. But if she had read this, she might have done a little preparatory work and put on some shoes that day, because she had a very difficult time with this man. And so that's an example of a time when just reading the chart would have done a lot of, would have benefited the whole situation very well. I had a situation myself in which a client came in, and this is one of the benefits from preparatory reviewing, in which this client felt very valued, because she came in the very first session. She told me that she'd written a book about her son, and I actually looked it up on Amazon and purchased a copy of it and reviewed that book before our second session. When she came in the second time, I had the book sitting on my desk and I had her sign it for me. And she felt very valued by that. And, I mean, it cost a few bucks. It wasn't a big deal. But I also recognized that reading, well, I'm an avid reader anyway, a prolific reader. I love to read anyway, but I thought, wow, what insights could I get? And I really did. And I didn't read it cover to cover, but I just perused it and was able to get a lot of insight about what was going on with this woman. And she felt very valued. So that's just an example of a way that you can do some preparatory reviewing. A lot of mistakes can be avoided, and one is failing to recognize, what if the client has a history of suicide attempts that you weren't aware of? You need to be aware of those kind of things. Some of the dangers that could happen by not reviewing preparatorily would be records could contain mistaken or outdated information, and a diagnosis or other information found in the record may cause you to form a stereotypical impression of the client before you meet them. When I was working in the Montana women's prison, I was advised to not open the files of the clients, to not know what they were in prison for. And I felt like this was helpful, because I didn't have a stereotypical impression. It was really interesting. One of the women that I worked with, she seemed such like one of the neatest people I've ever known, like someone I would meet in church, or in an education capacity, or as another professional. And I didn't find out what she was in for until much later. So come to find out, she had kind of wrong place at the wrong time. She had been drinking and ran a light, and ended up being in a traffic accident in which her own 7-year-old daughter, who was in the back of her car, was killed because she was driving under the influence. So she ended up going to prison for life, and I think that the judge made an example of her, something like this. This was in Montana many years ago, but anyway, there but for the grace of God go I, this kind of high-risk activity that she was participating in. I mean, I think most of us might have done something like that in our lives, and not ended up being in a wreck and having the loss of a child as a result of it. But very interesting. Once I found that out about her, it kind of changed my perspective of her, but I also had more respect for her in some ways. So there can be downfalls to depending on the setting. So the second is preparatory exploring. This involves asking questions about the client and their situation. And sometimes we can talk to the individual who did, if you didn't do the intake, the assessment on this individual, you can talk to the person who did. Sometimes a face-to-face conversation might bring up more. You might see, someone's body language. One of the things that you might consider in talking with colleagues, especially in a post-COVID world, is do FaceTime calls so that you can really evaluate nonverbal communication, body language, that kind of thing. Talk to the worker at the referring agency if that's applicable. Any previous workers if the client has been served at the agency before. Preparatory consulting is an important concept, and this involves seeking advice from social work supervisor or colleague concerning an upcoming visit with a prospective client. Among other things, it can be used to identify tentative objectives. What might the possible problems be with this in person. It might also help you understand more about this individual's culture, their religion, their ethnic group, and preparatory consulting may include a review of professional journals, government regulations, treatment resources. You need to be aware of your client's right to privacy and access information only to enhance the provision of services to your client. We're not accessing their information just for own curiosity. It's so that we can provide better services. One of my pet peeves, and you'll see this a lot in the world of mental health, is when clients become objectified by other professionals. And I want my students to rise above that. I want you to recognize that the people that you're working with deserve respect. They deserve, Stephen Covey said it well. He said, be loyal to those who are absent. So don't say anything about a client that you wouldn't say if they were sitting right there. And the same goes for coworkers, and this is a skill I think that would be good to practice with your friends and family right now. We don't say anything unless you would say it if that person was standing right next to you. Preparatory arranging. So arranging may include scheduling the appointment, ensuring adequate time and privacy, locating an interpreter. That can be super important in rural Nevada where we have a lot of Spanish speakers. If you don't have more than one language, you might need to find an interpreter. A lot of people, when they first start in social work, assume that there's going to be secretaries. You will have gone through a ton of education. I hope every one of you is planning to get your master's degree. And with that, you might, look around at the professional world and feel like, yeah, where's my secretary? When you start out, you might end up doing a lot of that secretarial work yourself, like arranging appointments, and give yourself time to do that. You're not alone. My son, who works as a home health nurse, he has to arrange every appointment himself. When I visit with him, he works 3 days a week, 3 12-hour shifts a week, and the day before his first shift, he's on the phone for several hours arranging appointments with people. And this is just kind of part of what we have to do in this world a lot of the time in this profession. So sometimes we might need to rearrange the furniture. Look around your office before your clients come in and see it as they would see it. If you're working with children, if you're working with families, make sure that there's adequate seating for who you have there. If you end up being a school social worker, that is a setting that you want to be able to make it enticing to young people. Ensuring personal hygiene. I've worked with professionals that have had body odor issues. You want to get over, make sure that you're showering, taking care of yourself, applying deodorant, using plenty of soap. There are some people that they're not going to value that like others will, but you want to come across as a professional, so that's an important aspect of it. I know it probably doesn't need to be said, but I will say it because it may need to be. Locating transportation for a client. This can be an important part, especially if you're working with someone on Medicaid and they don't have resources, they don't have a car. There are, in almost every community, there are services to get people to treatment, and make sure that you know what those are and have arranged that. Childcare might be something that you need to help arrange. And in one of my early jobs as a social worker, I worked at a respite daycare. And this was a childcare services offered to people in the community. I wish we had more of these services in Nevada. We need them. There's a lot of overwhelmed young moms and dads out there that could use some respite daycare once in a while. The next one is empathy. Preparing ourselves to have empathy for our client. Through preparatory empathy, you try to understand what the client is feeling related to seeking or receiving social services. So what if they're court ordered? You know, they might feel very forced to be there. They might come in with an attitude. So validating that, remember the importance of validating. You seem like you just don't want to be here. You know, sometimes that can be, that might assure that they come back. Yeah, I don't, you know. I don't mean to be rude, but I don't want to be here, you know. And you can say, you know, I can understand why you would feel that way. When you're preparing yourself in terms of empathy, remember that the goal is to gain increased appreciation for several things. First of all, for the client's motivation for the contact. You want to appreciate what their motivation is to be there. A lot of times you'll get people that, you know, they don't want to fix themselves. They want to fix someone else. And, you know, that's tricky, isn't it? Or impossible. Gain an increased appreciation for his or her thoughts and feelings about engaging an authority figure. You might come across, you might not think of yourself as one, but you might come across as an authority figure to those you work with. And, you know, how do they perceive you? If you're working with children, you know what? Anybody that's 3 or 4 years older than them, they perceive as an authority figure. And so recognizing that perspective is important. Another goal of empathy is to gain increased appreciation for potential issues related to the client's gender, to their sexual orientation, to their stage of life, to their culture, to their ethnic background, to their socioeconomic status. So thinking about these is going to be very important. If you're working with someone of the opposite sex, you might not see things from their perspective. And, you know, a woman working, a female social worker working with a man, you might have preconceived notions about their own sexism. And so you might need to think about those yourself before you address them. And recognize one of my big take-homes from my agency teaching domestic violence classes was the heavy burden that so many men feel in a sexist environment where they are the lone provider for the family. That is a heavy burden that a lot of men carry, and it's not easy. And so expressing appreciation, expressing empathy for how heavy of a burden that can be to men might be an important preparation. So because preparatory empathy takes place before the worker meets with the client and may be based on incomplete information, it is always tentative, it's always preliminary, and it's always subject to immediate change based on the client's actual communications, okay? So you might have prepared yourself to be empathetic of an individual because they have been previously diagnosed with an eating disorder, and they come into your office, and so you saw this previous diagnosis. You have an idea. You've worked with clients who've had eating disorders in the past. You have an idea of what this individual is going to be like. You suspect that they'll be very angry. You suspect that they'll be very controlling. But when they come in, they're not like that at all. So come to find out they have cancer. And that is why, and they were misdiagnosed with this happened to me once. They were misdiagnosed with an eating disorder, and they were nothing like you expected. And so make sure that no matter, you know, how you've prepared yourself, that you listen closely to the client's communication. So asking those open-ended questions, those listening skills that we talked about last week are very, very important. Okay, the next area of preparing yourself is preparatory self-exploration. During self-exploration, workers look at aspects of their personal histories which might influence their work with the client. what has triggered you in the past? And being triggered, I talked to a client once about when we're triggered, it's like pulling the trigger of a gun. And it can happen in such a way that it catches you off guard. When you're triggered in a session, you just never know. So making sure you've worked through issues that might trigger you is very important. Going over the client's file and recognizing, okay, this could be a triggering situation for me is an important part of preparation. Consider how the cultural and demographic similarities or differences between us is likely to affect you as a professional. Given what you know about the issue and the situation, what personal reactions might you expect to experience? Okay, we are people, we're not machines. And so you might have a personal reaction to something that you hear in a session. And they can be overwhelming. They really can. There have been times that after a client has left, I've been able to stay composed. And then after they've left, I've just closed the door and sobbed for a while. And, preparatory self-exploration can help you through that. I think it's important to recognize emotion is a big part of being a social worker. We're good at emoting traditionally. Most people that go into social work are kind of emotional types, We feel other people's emotion. We're empaths. I've heard us called that. And channeling our own emotions for empathy to that other person is what you want to do. You don't want to express emotion so freely that you make other people uncomfortable. But if you are triggered by an event that you hear expressed in a session, you can channel those emotions that you feel in terms of empathy for the client, and that can be an effective way to deal with being triggered. Workers might explore their current situation for factors which might interfere with quality service. So, is your blood sugar low? Have you ever? I get headaches if my blood sugar's low, so I keep Excedrin. If you've had lack of sleep, if you're having personal problems that cause distress, then a big part of what you need to do is center yourself. Centering includes identifying personal factors that might affect your ability to provide high quality service to a prospective client. You can use centering to attempt to manage or contain them. It involves organizing your personal thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations so that those feelings, those overwhelming emotions, potentially overwhelming emotions, don't interfere with the performance of your professional obligations and delivery of social services. So depending on personal factors involved, centering might include a variety of activities. Among the more common are brief stress management exercises, and this can be deep breathing exercises. These exercises reduce emotional reactivity and promote self-control. I like that idea of a birthday cake in front of you, taking a deep cleansing breath and blowing out the candles, right? Making sure that you take about 4 seconds to breathe in and longer to breathe out. What does that do? It infuses your brain with oxygen, and so that allows your thinking, instead of having that your thinking coming from your amygdala, it comes from the frontal lobe. Okay, right? More evolved type of thinking. You're going to be more logical than if you're thinking from your amygdala. You're going to be more emotionally reactive. Listen to your breathing. So most of the time you should be able to identify a general purpose or purposes for any given interview. A big part of preparing is going to be planning, recording. The general purposes of most social work interviews can be described as three different things, either informational, diagnostic, or therapeutic. So your first session is probably going to be informational. Even if they've already been assessed by someone in your agency, you're going to continue to be drawing information. A big part of the information that you're gathering is nonverbal communication, especially when you're working with young people, especially kids. You're going to watch their nonverbal communication, and that's going to help with the diagnostic process. You're going to take in the verbal communication as well. What if it doesn't match? What if a client says something, but their facial expressions say something different? Oh yeah, I really love my dad. Yeah, right? The third is therapeutic. So these are the main purposes. Once the purpose is identified, a preliminary plan for the meeting can be drawn up, and many of these first meetings have their primary purpose is the gathering of information. Begin the process of formulating a plan for an interview by asking questions like, what's the purpose of this meeting? What do I hope to accomplish? What would I consider a successful meeting? The written record that results from the preparatory for meetings can take several forms and include various components such as intake forms, face sheets, and then notes. So, do you take notes during a session or not? You know, this is individual. It kind of depended for me. A lot of the times I would take notes. I rarely did it with my laptop. Mostly I would do it with a pad and paper, kind of my own version of shorthand. And that seemed to be less offensive. It seems like if you have a computer in front of you, you know, even if it's a laptop, you have kind of a wall, right? And so you want to eliminate that. Again, you're going to reflect your client's body language, right? You're going to sit in a similar way that they sit. And I found that if I talked to the client before I took notes and said, you know, I'm going to be taking notes, I hope that's okay with you. Sometimes I would use my laptop, but only briefly. Like if I had a 40-minute session, I would tell them I'm going to use my laptop for the first 10 minutes or the first 20 minutes, but then I would put it away. And so I got pretty efficient at getting what I needed to get into my laptop in, you know, a few minutes so that I could dedicate time to that client. Sometimes I would do it at the beginning, sometimes I would do it at the end, but you'll figure out what works best for you. So that's my lecture for today. And this is a great chapter. Preparing is a big part of what you do, and you know, it all works together. And please don't hesitate to call, text, or email me if you have any questions about this week's assignments. And Daisy says hi. Daisy says bye. Bye, Daisy. Bye. All right. See you next time.